Headlines, May 2020. The world rejoices amidst the news that a cure for COVID has been discovered by none other than former funny man Noel Edmonds. The Deal or No Deal host spoke to the press today, saying, "You're probably wondering why a old has-been like myself has managed to save the day. And the answer is, I can take no credit. I was just footling around in my basement, opening random boxes, when I found some gunge left over from the days of Noel's house party. I had a funny feeling I should send a sample off to the hospital. They ran some tests, and blow me down if it isn't toxic to the virus." Apparently, the chief of medicine came to Mr. Edmonds' house to tell him the good news, but found Noel on a park bench with some scruffy-looking people. "We often come down here to mourn the death of our careers," said Noel. Upon examination, his scruffy companions turned out to include the boy band Busted, whoever directed the Cats film from last year, and Professor Neil Ferguson. In celebration, Noel was whisked away from the bench of despair and carried in a litter to Buckingham Palace to be knighted. Nationwide, people have celebrated this reversal of fortune by flying floral patterned shirts from flagpoles in honour of the new hero. It has been speculated that the upsurge in beards and longish hair could be as much a tribute to Noel as it could the product of the lockdown. "That's all nonsense," commented Noel. "Now excuse me, please. The phone's ringing, and I can't wait to tell the banker." My name's Andy. That's all fake news, sadly. And you're watching Alverstoke Antiviral.
Wow, welcome here to our interview, and this morning we're talking to David Stanford, who is the pastor of Solent Evangelical Church, about a mile and a half away from where we meet in Forton Road. David, really good to see you this morning, to have a chance to talk. How are you doing?
Yep, fine, thank you.
Good.
Yes.
Now, we go back quite a long way, don't we? We were just chatting before we started this Zoom. How many years ago was it that we sort of first came into contact with each other?
Well, it was particularly around the time I was about 13, and this was in 1987. So people with mathematical ability can work out my age. And I started going to the young people's work that Colin was involved in, and was one of the key leaders of. Yeah, it was quite a long time ago.
Were you already a Christian at the time that you came along to the youth work?
Yes, I'd become a Christian when I was, I think, around 5 or 6, in a very simple childlike way, which in a sense is how we all come to faith. But I would date it from that point. Yeah.
Right. And so you started coming along, if I remember, when you were about 13, to the youth work. And did that help you grow or mature in your understanding? Was there anything significant that God did in your life during that time, your teens and 20s?
Yeah, I think my feeling is when you become a Christian as a younger child, there's a sense in which, as you gain the independence of sort of increasing adulthood, the profession of faith and commitment to Christ is something that you need to kind of more consciously take with you into adulthood, because now you're independent and you're free to make those choices a bit more. You know, that suddenly makes it a real challenge. It's about my choices, whereas as a young child, a lot of the things that happen in your life are somebody else's decisions. And I think the thing that particularly was important to me at that point in my teens was the growing realization that the Bible was saying something very clear that needed to be understood and listened to, and that it needed to be acted on in all sorts of ways in your life. That it wasn't just something that you know, there to give you a nice word when you wanted it, but actually God was speaking through it, and I had to listen and take notice of it. And that kind of growing realization was really important to me as I sort of went through those teenage years and was working out what was going to matter in my life as an adult.
And that led, in due course, I mean, you were in secular, as we call it, employment. That led you eventually to Solent here. What was there anything sort of key in that movement from secular work to becoming a pastor that caused you to make that decision?
It was a sort of a growing thing that it's difficult to sort of trace to any one moment, but alongside what I was doing in secular work, I was doing a lot in terms of church and young people's work as I got older, and was enjoying explaining the Bible and all of those kind of things. But it was a sort of a growing thing where it was actually I came to the point where I realised actually I'd rather be giving much more of my time to this, and the work I was doing in the secular field, which I enjoyed, but it wasn't like I wanted to be doing that forever, and actually I had a greater desire to work full time in this role, which I'd been sort of doing in my free time up until that point.
Yeah, and we were involved as Alverstoke Evangelical Church on encouraging you to come down and in calling you to the post at Solent. And as we've already said, we go back quite a long way. And you've now been a pastor, was it 12, 13 years?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, I only know that because we talked about it yesterday, because I'm rubbish with years. How are you coping now as a pastor? Because the situation you're currently in, you're in your office now, which is a shed at the bottom of the garden. How are you coping with lockdown and this whole new scenario?
Personally, or
personally?
Well, I'm sort of a fairly sort of laid back personality in some respects. So it's sort of okay. This is the situation. So I personally, it's not been difficult. Obviously, there are difficulties associated, but fundamentally, I wouldn't have said it's kind of been a hard thing. It's just been something to deal with. I mean, my work has personally in a sense carried on. Quite a lot of the sort of shape of my week is still there in slightly different form. So that's continued for me. Obviously with some new challenges and things to work on and get to grips with. But so in that sense, it's not been too bad really. So I feel I feel okay about it, and just have had to try and work out a few new things.
Yeah, and you're still smiling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's good to see. And so that's personally. I mean, you've got how many daughters at the moment? I mean, I just wondered if that had increased since we last talked.
No. Still 4, which is plenty. Yeah, so it's a house full. I mean, that's the thing that has changed in the sense that the week, my working week, I work at home. I've got an office at the end of the garden, and when I'm there, it feels fairly normal. When I go back to the house, there's all sorts of chaos now going on with 5 people in the house, and so that's quite different. We've got a spread of ages, so and it's been quite interesting. In our house, we've got quite a few different kind of the lockdown has affected people in our house differently. The sense, as I said, for me, it's not changed a great deal. For Michelle, her life has quietened down quite a bit. She's been able to try and catch up on some stuff around the house that's inevitably sort of fallen by the wayside. Rhiannon, who's our eldest daughter, she's been furloughed from a job working for a charity in Chichester, and she's found it quite frustrating. She's sociable, likes seeing people, and finds it difficult. Josie was supposed to be sitting her A-levels at this very moment, and she's at what to me would be a good news, but to her it was a disappointment that her exams were cancelled. She was all kind of keyed up for them, and suddenly all of that's been taken away, along with the whole sort of social side of that last year of A-levels. So I think the older 2 kids probably have had the worst sort of experience, and it's been a bit harder for them. The younger two, Molly, who's year 9, and Amelie, who's year 6, they're doing a bit of homework at home, and it's sort of an extended summer holiday, really. I'm not sure it's really they've suffered a great deal, but there's been quite a range of sort of things to deal with. But I think generally we've got on okay with it.
Yeah, because we've I don't know if you've noticed this. I mean, when we sit down in the living room sometimes to eat, there's like 6 of us men, more or less, boys, which gives a feel to the living room all of its own. And you've got like 5 women of various ages in your house. Must be very different, but also quite unusual, because you're not usually all together, are you, for such a long period of time?
No. And that's both good and has its own difficulties. There's that slight feeling of cooped up, and can't get away from it. But also I think there's been an opportunity to kind of work, relationally, work together a bit better. So that I think it's had positives as well as negatives.
Good, thank you. And Church, you've sort of mentioned about this situation. You mentioned beforehand when we've chatted about things being thrown up into the air. How have you enjoyed that or not? I mean, what has your experience of that been? Well, as a church, I'm thinking of really here.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, church is very much about being together, and it's about that sort of community, and that has been taken away, the physical side of that, and that's a real loss, and there are problems associated with that. I think what I find it very hard to instantly say this is bad for church wholly, because it seems to me that there are some good things. I think it's quite refreshing to kind of have the things, sometimes we rely quite a lot on the sort of regular patterns, and it can kind of save you having to think too much about why you do what you do and what the priorities should be, because you're just following the track that you've sort of laid out ahead of you in your calendar. And what this did, it just sort of, calendars became an irrelevance, and everything's thrown up in the air. So suddenly you've got to say as a church, well, what matters? Because, we've got to answer that question from scratch. There's no calendar determining what we're going to do. And I think that's quite a positive thing, because you have to think from kind of what are our basic priorities and principles, and how we're going to satisfy those in this time of lockdown. So I think that's quite a positive thing to have to do, and hopefully I hope there will be positive outcomes from this in terms of our grasp of what does matter. And we'll be really glad to be able to meet together properly again, but hopefully we will have learned quite a bit through the process. And I also think personally, sometimes we can become kind of reliant on simply a routine that protects us from thinking too much about our lives, and to suddenly have all of that taken away, we're sort of a little bit exposed to ourselves, laid bare, and we have to think, okay, there's things about myself I'm discovering, and things that perhaps I was rather avoiding because it was easy to avoid them in the busyness of life. Well, I can't avoid them anymore, so it creates a brilliant opportunity to kind of grapple with some of those things. So, depending on how we deal with it, lockdown and all of that could be really positive for us. Obviously, what has caused it is bringing negatives in lots of people's lives, but the potential is there for it to really positively affect us, I think.
That's great. Thank you very much, David. I'm going to pretty much draw it to a close there, just to say that we've been looking at Colossians, which talks about the gospel growing all over the world, and also how it was bearing fruit in the people there. And it's great to hear you talking about when you were younger, growing, as you realised that the Bible did actually speak into life situations, and that growing is still happening through lockdown in different ways and in facets, and that there's a positive aspect to this experience. And I hope that's certainly, I've enjoyed it. and we wouldn't normally be having a conversation quite like this if it wasn't for lockdown. So I'm grateful for that, being able to ask you these questions. I haven't even been rude or impertinent, which is quite strange.
Amazing.
It is. We'll have to do another one sometime. Thank you very much, David.
So thank you.
Well, I'm here with Colin now, and we're going to be talking about the book of 1 Samuel. And as a way into this, I've got a question that 1 Samuel sort of helps us answer. And that's a question not a lot of people think about. And the question is, how would God treat me? How would God treat me if I met him? If I met him after death? If I encountered him and he knew me and he knew the person I was inside and out, how would he react to me? How would he treat me? That's a question that the book of Samuel is actually really helpful in answering, because, well, here's the way into the answer. You might know there's a hymn called Tell Out My Soul. And in the 3rd verse of that hymn, there's a line that says this. It says, proud hearts and stubborn wills are put to flight, the hungry fed, the humble lifted high. And there's a raising and a lowering going on there, isn't there? There's the proud hearts and the stubborn wills they're put to flight, but the hungry are being fed and the humble are being lifted high. And that switch, that raising and lowering, is something, well, it's from the Bible. It's from Luke's Gospel, where Mary is pregnant with Jesus and she sings this song about what God is doing through Jesus and what he's going to do. But actually, she's actually recycling material from a very old song, a song that actually is the key really to understanding 1 Samuel. It comes right at the start of 1 Samuel chapter 2. I'll show you some words here and just look at the comparison between what Mary says in her song, with that idea of the proud and the stubborn wills being put to flight, and the hungry being fed, and the humble lifted high. So here is some of 1 Samuel 2 even. It says, the bows of the warriors are broken, but those who stumbled are armed with strength. Those who were full hire themselves out for food, but those who are hungry no more. She who was barren has borne 7 children, but she who has many sons pines away. The Lord brings death and makes alive. He brings down to the grave and he raises up. The Lord sends poverty and wealth. He humbles and he exalts. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap. He seats them with princes and has them inherit a throne of honor. For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world. He will guard the feet of his faithful servants, but the wicked will be silenced in the place of darkness. It is not by strength that one prevails. Colin, that's a pigeon.
Oh, sorry.
Read the Bible here.
He has a mind of his own. Just carry on, Andy.
Raising and lowering, people. The Most High will thunder from heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And perhaps you can see, I mean, maybe we could have a demonstration with that pigeon of the raising and the lowering. Maybe that would be a way to save the situation somehow. But there's a great raising and lowering, isn't there? Because with some, the humble, the poor on the ash heap, God raises them up. And he's going to raise up his anointed. So we raise the pigeon to demonstrate that. Thank you, Colin. But he brings down others. He says, do not be proud, do not be arrogant. And that idea of a raising and lowering is absolutely key to the book of 1 Samuel, because it doesn't just happen in chapters 1 and 2 when Samuel's mum, who doesn't have children, is given a baby by God and so raised up, and so her proud co-wife can't boast of her anymore. It's actually key to the entire book, because what happens in 1 Samuel, as we understand the transition from the days of the judges to the kings, is we see basically the key characters of the book. There are 4 key characters, and they all have their ups and downs. So I've called it the first messiahs, because that word anointed in the song is the word Messiah, the anointed king. It starts off with Eli and the house of Eli going into decline. because Eli is the priest and his sons are the priests at the tabernacle at the time, and they are very dysfunctional. The sons of Eli are monkeying around and are very immoral, and they don't take God's word seriously at all. And people remember the famous story early on about the boy Samuel who lives with Eli in the tabernacle, and how he's called to at night by God, and he doesn't realize God's calling him. But then Eli says, "Oh, say, speak, for your servant is listening." And then God speaks to him. People remember that story. They don't remember what God actually says to Samuel, though. You remember what God says to Samuel? It's quite shocking, actually. What he says is, "I am going to bring the house of Eli down." That's the message he gives to Samuel. He says, your boss, Eli, and his family are going down because the sons are out of order and their dad is not putting a stop to this. I'm going to wreck them. And I'm going to humble them for their arrogance in the way they're behaving. And that's what happens. Chapter 4, in the middle here, we get the glory departing from Israel because they go out to fight a battle with the Ark of the Covenant. And not only do they lose, and not only are the sons of Eli killed, but the ark itself is lost, which is a disaster because the ark is connected with God's presence with Israel and his power and his glory. And that ark is captured by the Philistines. And when Eli hears the news, he falls from his chair and breaks his neck and dies. And it's a disaster for Israel. And the house of Eli is brought low. And a baby is born to the house on that day. And that baby, or at that time, and that baby is called Ichabod, which is one of those very weird Bible names, which sometimes Christians call their children, although I've never met one. And Ichabod means no glory, or where is the glory? Because the glory is gone at this point. It's really, really severe, actually, that God has brought down this house. But at the same time, as he judges them and brings them down, do you know what he also does? He also raises up Samuel, and Samuel becomes the last of the judges, and he fights the famous Ebenezer battle where he sets up a stone, the stone of help, Ebenezer, because God has helped him to win this battle, just like the days of Joshua. So he's an old sort of old-fashioned judge type who fights Israel's enemies and wins with God's strength and encourages the people to trust in God. And so just as the one house comes down, so the house of Samuel goes up. And the big sort of drama in the book happens really around chapters 8 when Samuel's house comes to its end, because Samuel gets old and his sons are no good. Like Eli's sons, I'm afraid, they're not very moral. And so the people say, we've got a problem here. Our judge is not working. And we need a king. And they ask for a king, which is a strange thing because we'd expect that to be a good moment, wouldn't we, Colin? Because we've had stuff in the Bible about God promising kings.
Well, yeah, and Deuteronomy had a whole section, didn't it, about when you get a king, what he's to be like, what effect it would have upon the people. So there has been some talk about it as being something that was allowable or permissible. Yeah. It
was something in God's plan. I mean, he promised that, kings will come from you. He promised that back in, Genesis and Numbers and stuff. But look how the people ask for a king. They say to Samuel, you are old and your sons do not follow your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have. Then we will be like the other nations with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles. And can you see what sort of king they want? The problem is they ask for a good thing, but they ask for it the wrong way. They ask for bad motives because they want to be like the other nations. Now remember, they're supposed to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. They're supposed to be separate and relying on God and with God as their king. And they seem to be looking over the fence at the neighboring nations and saying, oh, we want to get our security the way the pagans do. We want a sort of self-reliant superhero who can fix everything and solve our battles and give us security. I think this is a bit like people saying, well, all my non-Christian friends have a girlfriend or a boyfriend who they sleep with, and therefore, well, that's how they get love and security and family, and therefore I should do the same because that's what everyone around me is doing. They're seeking something which is not necessarily bad in itself, love and security, but they're seeking it the wrong way and copying the nations instead of looking to God. And because they ask for this king like this, God is very, very critical of them. He says that they've rejected me as their king. They're rejecting God in doing so. And because they do, going back to our amazing diagrams, God actually gives them what they want. He gives them the green line. And the green line is the house of Saul. God gives them a king. But he's the sort of king who's good for about 5 minutes and then starts acting just like the nations.
So are the colours significant there? Green Party, Liberal Democrats rising, and the purple for the House of Samuel. I don't know. That would be the UKIP party, wouldn't it?
It would. I mean, this would be some parallel universe where politics maps onto various Israelite kings. But I wasn't going with that, actually, no.
No, okay.
No, but I was going for the idea, as you can see from the rough shape, that Saul is appointed king, and over a few chapters, and God says, well, I'm going to give you this king, and he gives them what they want, as he often does actually in the Bible. When we sin, he hands us over to what we've chosen. He gives them a king like the nations. And Saul wins about one battle. And then chapters 13 and 15, this bit, we get 3 incidents, chapter 13, 14, 15. And in each of those incidents, we don't have time to go into it all, but Saul categorically fails to obey God and to trust him. He actually makes up the rules as he goes along. He swears stupid oaths. He ends up jeopardizing Jonathan's life because he starts acting like Jephthah and making silly vows. He acts as his own priest. He behaves like Achan. He keeps some of the plunder for himself. And it's very, very dramatic. And Samuel in 13 and 15 basically says, I have a message from God for you, Saul, and that message is you are going out. You have done a foolish thing, Samuel said. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God gave you. If you had, he would have established your kingdom over Israel for all time. But now your kingdom will not endure. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart and appointed him ruler of the people, because you have not kept the Lord's command. And what's happening there is the same thing with Eli. God is raising and lowering. He is bringing down the proud and those who think they do not need to obey God and they do not need to trust and respect him. Even if they're the king of his people, God will bring them down. And instead, he's going to bring up the yellow line, which is the sort of king that God has chosen. And that phrase, a king according to his heart, I don't think that means David is especially godly and cares about what God wants, although that does come out in the narrative elsewhere. I think what it means is that God has chosen him according to God's own heart. So this is not the king requested by the people's choice. This is the king God is going to appoint, whether the people like it or not. And in David's coronation, that's really, or in his selection in 16, that's really clear that he's the younger son. He's not impressive in the outward appearance compared to his older brothers, and he's just a kid who's looking after sheep. But God has made a choice and says, I'm going to have David as king, and I'm going to have him and exalt the horn of my anointed. I'm going to raise up this humble one as my king. And straight away we see that, because chapter 17, everyone's favorite Bible passage in the Old Testament in 1 Samuel, David and Goliath. It's an amazing scene where the whole Israel army and their anointed Saul are being useless. They're fighting the Philistines, and the champion Goliath is threatening them, and they're too scared, and none of them will fight him. And then this kid turns up, bringing, visiting his brothers, and says, well, I'll fight him. And he can't even put on all Saul's armor. He says, this is not going to work. I'm not going to fight with myself. I'm not used to it. And with a simple weapon, he takes down this incredible Schwarzenegger of an adversary, Goliath. And what he says, and it is really interesting because it's so clear that it's not because David is a superior fighter. Why does he fight him? It's because God is with him. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword, spear, javelin. I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Because Goliath is proud as well. He's boasting against God and his people. And God will bring down the proud. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down. I'll cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, but the battle is the Lord's. He will give all of you into our hands. Point being, I'm not going to win because I'm a superior fighter or because I've got better tactics. I'm going to win because God's power is what decides the battle, and I'm God's anointed, and God, through his anointed king, is going to give the victory. That's how he saves, and that's where the idea of savior king comes in, because the job of the king is to save his people from their enemies. And it's so clear that this kid now is the real anointed. He's the one doing the job, saving the people, and he does it not through his own strength, but through God's strength. So the house of David, their stock goes through the roof early on, and the house of Saul plummets. And crucially, God's showing us through this book what kind of a king we need. We need a king who's not like Saul. We need a king who's more like David, who relies in God's strength, who is humble, but God exalts and lifts up. Although for the rest of the book, we also see then that he's a king who was persecuted, because what happens for the rest of the book, 18 to 31, is all one big thematic section. Because what happens is that Saul realizes that David is now basically functionally the savior of the nation. He is the one who has the kingdom. Everyone loves him. Even Saul's own family love him. And Saul gets jealous and Saul tries to kill him, which is why he's got that big spear throwing the javelin there. Because on several occasions, Saul tries to kill him. And we see that God's anointed king, although he has God's power to win, is also a persecuted king. He's a king who God's adversaries, those who disobey God, will come after. And in all sorts of ways, Saul comes after David and sends men after him and throws spears at him on several occasions. Saul is the sort of person who should not be left alone with a spear. Colin, yeah, that's the lesson I take away from 1 Samuel, because several times he tries to kill people with spears.
Yeah, he could do with a harpist more often, couldn't he? Wasn't David's music meant to soothe him?
Yeah, David's music was meant to soothe him.
Even so, it didn't happen all the time, did it?
No, and this fear of David and the fact that the kingdom is slipping away from Saul means that Saul goes after David as much as he possibly can. He sets him up in battle to die. He chases him around mountains and all this stuff. He sends men after him. And so we have two kings. We have a true Messiah and a sort of ex-Messiah, an anti-Messiah, we could say. And the one is persecuting the other. And it gets farcical because, even Jonathan and Michal, Saul's own children, side with David and recognize that the kingdom is David's, and they need to side with the one God is with, God's appointed king. And even Saul flip-flops at points when David spares his life, because David shows by his good character, I'm innocent, I don't deserve this persecution, and I'm not even going to kill you, Saul, when you come into this cave and I have a chance to stab you and finish you off. I'm not going to do that because I respect you as the Lord's anointed. And so we get this good character of David, and Saul, he flip-flops. He says, oh, David, I'm sorry. And then he goes back into psycho mode and tries to kill him. But basically, no matter how Saul tries, he can't win. That's the point. The house of David survives, and he keeps trying to kill him, but he fails and fails and fails. And the book ends with him in this pathetic situation where he's consulting a ghost to try and find out what's going to happen and what can be done as the witch of Endor. And he summons the ghost of Samuel, and Samuel's ghost says to him, all he says is, Saul, I've told you what's happening. I'm going to say the same thing I said to you chapters ago, that the kingdom is being taken from you in judgment. God is bringing you down and he's exalting another. He's bringing down and he's raising up. That's what's going on here. And the book ends with Saul and his sons killed in a battle by their enemies. And the house of Saul comes to ruin. And the book of 2 Samuel will then show us how the house of David fares. But the big point is that it's this raising and lowering going on. I think it's God exalting his king while also having a commitment to bring down the proud and raise up the humble. And this is how it answers the question, how would God treat us? How might God react to someone like us? Well, proud hearts, stubborn wills will be put to flight. The warning for us there, when we're like Saul and when we're like Eli, when we disobey God, we can't expect God to just be our friend he brings down the proud and the disobedient. He judges sin. Maybe not today, maybe not even in this life, but he will one day. And the only hope is not human strength, human ability, and human pride. It's actually the lack of those things and a realization that we need to throw ourselves on God in humility and appeal to his mercy and trust his power to save. And we see here that his power to save happens through his true anointed king, David. David is the one who saves his people. And Jonathan sees that in the story. Jonathan appeals to David to show kindness. Another character, Abigail, who, if your name's Abigail, this is the book in the Bible where we get an Abigail. She says to David, basically, remember me when God gives you all the success. It's almost that Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. It's a recognition, this is the true king, and I need to appeal to him, to his kindness, and join him and side with him and realize that he will rule. And therefore, I need to appeal to his mercy, because that's how God will save, through his anointed king, and he will exalt those who humble themselves. And didn't Jesus say something like that? He said, all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and God will lift up those who are humble. He talks about that with the Pharisee and the tax collector, the proud who says, aren't I a wonderful person? Thank you, God, that I'm better than other people, versus the person who says, Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. And that's such an important part of the gospel, isn't it? That actually there's exalting and humbling, Colin, going on.
Yeah, I know. It's picked up in various places in the Bible. In James talks about it. Peter talks about it. And the story that we look at in Samuel is rather sad, because Saul starts off quite humble. He's found hiding amongst the baggage train when Samuel comes to call him. And yet very quickly, as he's raised up to be king, it goes to his head and his heart. Yeah, and David himself was the youngest, wasn't he, of all of the sons? And Samuel was told not to look on the exterior, but the fact that because God looks on the heart and considers that more important. Yeah, and I guess we today, we live in a celebrity culture, don't we? We live in a day when people are exalted for worldly achievements, really. But what is meant to be significant in a person is that humble spirit, gentleness, kindness, willingness to serve. That actually isn't found that often in some of the icons of today.
Well, I was going to ask about that as well as a final thought. Do you think there's a sense in which we look to the nations and we actually look to worldly attributes in the same way that the Israelites wanted a king like the nations? Do you think that's an issue for us today, in where we find security and all the rest of it?
I think it is an issue today. I mean, since it was an issue with them, and since men's hearts haven't really changed, it will still be an issue to some degree today. But we do look to sort of extol various people. We've mentioned the NHS before, who are doing great work across the country, but that obscures the fact that actually they can only deal so much with the sickness and the illness. They're not stopping it, they're not exterminating it, and we actually need a much greater saviour than them, much as we might appreciate what they do. Yeah. So and the whole elections of parties and people getting very keyed up about which one they want to succeed and win sort of shows an idolizing of a person or an ideology. And we're meant to be distinctly different, but of course, because we've lived and grown up in it all, we get caught up with it. Sometimes there's good things in politics, for instance, but we can get so caught up in it, we forget who the real rescuer is. Yeah, I think.
Absolutely. But Samuel points us towards it, and we'll hear more about that next time for 2 Samuel, but it prepares us for God's choice of king, a king like David, and a king who is humble, and a king who's persecuted, a king who actually is persecuted to death, the Lord Jesus, but who saves nonetheless, and who shows mercy and includes people into his kingdom, even though we are proud, because he calls us to humble ourselves, doesn't he?
He does. Yeah.
Okay, then. Well, that's 1 Samuel. I think we'll leave the rest to 2 Samuel. So thank you very much for watching, everybody. And until next time, stay close to Jesus and wash your hands.